several of the important reasons for boiling that you need to know. We talked about findings, clarified that findings are either in the boil or in the fermenter. We talked about making sure you know the technical name for yeast, Saccharomyces, specifically Saccharomyces cerevisiae, ale yeast, and the new Pastorianus, Saccharomyces pastorianus, for the new lager yeast. And the difference between those two, lager ferments out a little drier, ferments some additional sugars like raffinose, right? We talked about wild yeast like Brettanomyces. We talked about the different stages that fermentation goes through. We talked about attenuation. We talked about aeration versus oxidation. We talked about the nutrients that yeast needs, nitrogen, amino and fatty acids in addition to sugar, oxygen initially. Talked about the hot solventy alcohols that can sometimes be produced. Sherry-like oxidation of melannoidins, creates that sherry or port-like character. Acetaldehyde. Yeast autolysis, being sewer-like. Then we got into the styles, talked about the Scottish ales, really being focused on kettle caramelization and not a big use of crystal malt, right? Low hops, roasted barley in the finish to help dry it out. Remember all those things? Don't want to get too smoky, hardly at all with those, even though it says in the guideline you can. Talked about the strong Scotch ale. Talked about the English browns, specifically the Northern English brown being kind of a nutty character with an acceptable diacetyl at low levels. The mild being a really small beer. So the nutty Northern Newcastle, remember, and the sweet Southern, back sweetened and really lots of fruit, licorice, and molasses type character in the real small mild. Talked about the English bitters, 3 sizes basically of that beer. Lots of crystal malt, gives the caramel character. English hops, at a level you can smell and taste. Talked about the American ales, pale ale, amber ale, brown ale. Pale's all about the hops, brown's more about the malt. Red's a little more focused in the middle, caramel malt. Remember, we judged a beer. We judged what was supposed to be an ESB, and it was actually Anchor Steam, right? California Common. Had that same kind of caramel malt character. Had a woodsy, earthy Northern Brewer hop character in there, which comes off more like an English hop. And those beers are quite similar sometimes. And then we got to the IPAs, and that is where we stopped. So that's where we will pick up tonight, except not in exactly that order. Tonight, very quickly, we are going to cover recipe formulation. This was obviously a much bigger deal on the legacy exam because there was one question that was always on the test. Out of the 10 questions that was always on the test, one of them was a recipe formulation question. But again, I keep going back to, if it was important then, it's going to be important now. But I'm sure they're going to find ways to ask you questions about brewing these beers. So I would still know everything that you had to know before. Just realize that you're not going to have to write it out as a recipe. But you could be quizzed over it. So here was the question. We covered this briefly before. These were the main styles. Of course, you should know roughly how to put a recipe together for every style. But since these were the ones that were more focused on before, I would definitely, if I could only know a handful, I would know these. Okay? That's how they were graded. these were some of the, an alternative grading scheme was to look at each one of these: volume, water, grist, mash, boil, hops, chill, yeast, ferment, OG, FG, carbonation technique, aroma, appearance, flavor, mouthfeel. Pretty much everything that you would write in a recipe. So here's some quick rules of thumb. I mean, what if a question, if it was important to know before that you knew how to put a recipe together for any given style of beer, specifically one of those, then let's assume it's going to still be important that you know how to do this. So I would ask questions like, what kind of malt is used in this? You know, if it's a multiple choice or true false, what kind of malt is used in this? How much malt? Multiple choice. 5 pounds, 8 pounds, 10 pounds. What would be most appropriate for a 5-gallon batch of X, right? Those are ways to break that recipe question down into simple steps. Again, I don't know that these questions are on there, and it may take years for everybody to get through enough of the exam to really see what types of questions are on there, because there's a question pool of about 2,000. So kind of have to have exposure to a lot of exams in order to get a sense of what all the questions really are. But I would guess that these types of questions would be on there. So there were some rules of thumb and some rough guidelines that got put together for handling the recipe question then, and I think it still applies to learn these lessons now. So if you looked at a 5-gallon batch, and again, this is just a real rough rule of thumb, but if you took those last 2 digits, like a 1030, and you take the 3, and you put a decimal point in there and call that 3.0, and you multiply that by 2, you're going to need about 6 pounds of grain for a 5-gallon batch.
And that's total, or is that base?
Total.
Okay.
Grains or sugars. So, I mean, think of like a 1050 batch, or a 1050 beer, an average size beer that you might brew. How much grain it goes in the mash tun? About 10 pounds. It's about right. I mean, I make 10-gallon batches, usually use about 20 pounds. You know, plus or minus depending on the style. But if I'm making an average size beer, if I'm making a little bigger beer, then I'm maybe 22 pounds for that 10-gallon batch. So it's kind of a good rough rule of thumb to look at. You know, 1070 beer, 7.0, take it times 2, about 14 pounds of grain. So you know you're in the ballpark. If you get a question, how much grain would be in a beer? Well, how big is it? Know the style, know how big it is, know what the OG on it would be, and take those last 2 digits, and that should get you in the ballpark. When putting those recipes together, base malt is typically going to comprise about 80 to 100%. So if you know all your base malts, you know that's going to be the bulk of the recipe in most cases. Pale malts are highly converted, so they work well for single-step infusion mashes. British malts tend to be a bit darker, have a nutty flavor. Pilsner malt, lighter in color. Just know some of these basic things about malt. If you've been brewing a long time, you already know a lot of this stuff, which is great. If you have been brewing a long time, then you should study this. Specialty malts usually comprise about 20% or less, and a lot of times even 10% or less of the grain bill. Toasted malts like Victory, Biscuit, Aromatic, caramel malts like the Carapils and the British and American Caramel. So the caramel malts, the roasted malts, and then of course roasted barley, which is kind of its own category. Adjunct grains, usually 20% or less. Sugars, usually 10% or less. Hops, usually 1 to 2 ounces for a 5-gallon batch. A broader range might be a 1/2 ounce to 4 ounces. Okay. Again, these are things you know if you brew a lot. So you may not have to study this too much. If you don't brew that much, these are some general rules of thumb that you should just keep in mind. Know the noble hops. Remember shots, Saz, Hallertau, Tettnang's fault. Know what the different hops do, different varieties, different flavors. Conditioning, wait a minute, extraction and maximum yield. This was important if you had to explain yourself as to how much malt you were using on that recipe question. I doubt that you're going to get into this, but you should at least know what ppg, points per pound per gallon, or points per pound per 5 gallons, which is that number divided by 5. And there's basically just different yields. There's ratings on different malts and the different yields you're going to get out of them. And you can run it through this whole complicated thing, and if you were writing the old recipe question, this really told the grader that you understood extraction and efficiency and all those types of things. Note that 75% efficiency, mash efficiency is kind of a good average to shoot for, about 75%. This was a couple questions. We're not going to cover this in any kind of detail, but this was actually putting together a recipe. Did one for a dry stout, just do one for a doppelbock. So if you start out at 1090, 75% efficiency assumed, multi-profile, use those three malts. You took it through the PPG and the PP5G. And you see what kind of yield you're getting out of it. And you can run it through the calculations here and come up with about 17 pounds broken out by 3.2, 6.9, 6.9 for the pills, Munich, and Vienna. Or, you see the blue highlighted or way down there on page 100. Everyone there with me? Page 100. So, if we did the whole calculation system, we ended up with about 17 pounds and a split of about 377. If we did it by that rough rule of thumb, and we said we had an OG of 1090, take those last two digits, put a decimal point in there, that's a 9 times 2, about 18 pounds. And if we did 18 and we did a 20-40-40 split, then guess what? We end up with about 3.5, 7, and 7. So pretty close, not even doing the math, and just doing the simple rule of thumb technique. Does everyone see that? And that's actually a decent recipe for a doppelbock. Same thing then for a dry stout. Taking it through all the calculations, we ended up with about 8 pounds, about 7 pounds of pale, about 3/4 pound of roasted barley, and 1/4 pound of flaked barley. And if you did the same thing, except you just did it in percentages, 1045, gravity, 4.5 times 2, about 9 pounds of grain. If you did a 90%, 7%, 3% split, you end up about the same place, about 8 pounds, 3/4 pound, 0.25 pounds. Actually works. Know these styles. These were the styles that you used to have to write a recipe on. So very quickly, if you got a Belgian triple, it's a high gravity beer, right? Pills and sugar, it's going to be your grain bill. Styrian golden hops, spicy phenolic fruity ale yeast. Oktoberfest, average gravity, malt focus, Munich, Vienna malt, decoction mash, German hops, lager yeast. Right? It's like if you can just remember these basic things about those beers, you can really start to paint that picture of what that beer is like, as well as how to put a recipe together for it. Okay. So go on through those, make sure that you understand what's in those beers, at least for those handful of styles that we used to be asked about. John Palmer had another way of looking at it there on page 103, using base malt, and he basically just kept building on this pale base malt, and then a little caramel, and then a little dark caramel, and then some chocolate, and then some roasted barley, and kind of stepping up through the different styles, which is kind of an interesting way of looking at it. Page 104, conditioning and carbonation. The main thing we're going to talk about here is carbonation. And you need to know the volumes of CO2 for various beer styles. Also, in that recipe question, if you're bottle conditioning, about 3/4 of a cup of corn sugar for a 5-gallon batch. Page 105 at the bottom, your low carbonated British ales, about 1.5 to 2.0 volumes of CO2. Porters and stouts, 1.7, 2.3. Belgian ales, American ales, working its way up to the German wheat, which is really high. If you just kind of remember that scale and just think, the British ales are always some of the lowest carbonated. Think of those beers being served on cask. You want those extremely low carbonated beers, and that's going to be around 1.5 at the lowest. Up to German wheat beer, super effervescent, really high carbonation, a real big head coming off of it at about 4.5 volumes. Okay. So it's not a big range, and so you can kind of put the beers into a category in there. American ales are kind of right in the middle, kind of average. Okay. Rules of thumb to know. Get into some flavors, not flavors. The dark malts, or grains, I should say, and the Lovabond that goes with them. Chocolate malt, around 400 L. Chocolate malt is what gives you that baker's chocolate, cocoa, bitter, sweet type cocoa flavor. It's not milk chocolate, it's not sweet chocolate. It's more of a baker's chocolate, just kind of that dry, not necessarily bitter, but just sort of a dry cocoa flavor. I always think of like Hershey's baking cocoa. I brewed with it a couple of times, so it's what always comes to mind. That flavor, it's exactly what you get out of chocolate malt. Black patent malt. This one is really what gives you that charred, burnt type character. This is the really roasty flavor. And then roasted barley, remember that it's not a malt, it is just roasted barley. And that is often described as that coffee-like character, quintessential to stouts. Cloudiness. Chill haze is the #1 cause of cloudy beer. Can be caused by an insufficient cold break during cooling after the boil. Could also just be that, we always think of a bad reason why a beer may be cloudy. Always remember that it could just be the yeast. It could just be low flocculating yeast, and it could be yeast still in suspension. So either you didn't get a good break and you still got proteins floating around in it, or it's a low flocculating yeast, or it wasn't filtered. One of those things can give you some cloudiness. It's usually some proteins still floating around in the beer, residual starches. Phenolic, good phenolics, bad phenolics. Medicinal phenolic, usually bacterial, but we talked about how that can also sometimes be from oversparging or sparging with alkaline water and that sort of thing when it's at a lower level. Some of the good phenols, clove-like phenol in Weizen beers, spicy peppery type phenols in Belgian beers. Musty is a stale aroma and taste associated with the oxidation of malt compounds in the melanoidin family. Oxidation can occur in the mash or boil via hot side aeration, don't know so much about that anymore, or by exposure to air when racking or bottling. So musty can be an oxidation issue with those small compounds. Moldy. I hope your beer is not moldy, but have seen it. I got a beer once that had a growth inside the bottle. I'm like, a black mold growth in there. It happens. It's usually an infection. Your beer's moldy. And it's going to taste moldy. Literally moldy. Sour or acidic. Two ways of saying that. Acidic is sour. Sour is acidic. There's two types, lactic and acetic. Lactic is more common in a variety of beers. It is a more pleasant sourness. Lactic can really be a refreshing sourness. That's, a Berliner Weiss, that really quenching acidity in a Berliner Weiss. That's a pure, clean, wonderful lactic sourness. What are other beers that can have a lactic sourness?
Lambics.
Yes. Acetic is that more vinegary character. I think the Flanders Red is the only beer that should ever have an acetic character. It can be in other beers, but it'd be bad if it was in anything else. What about lactic though? Berliner Weiss, right? How about Saison? Saison. That quenching acidity. The quenching acidity, that's a characteristic part of the style of a Saison. A hint of sourness. Not so much where you describe it as sour, but it's a nice quenching acidity, as it is described in the guidelines. That's a lactic sourness. It's just very minor. Some of the stouts use a little, used to be, lacto contamination, or add a little, add up to 3% of sour beer. When they're talking about sour beer, they're talking lactic sour. Add up to 3% lactic sour beer to it to give it that little touch of lactic sourness. When you're making one, a lot of times you use a little acid malt. So stout can have a little, about Hefeweizen. Hefeweizen can sometimes have a tartness. Tartness is allowed in Hefeweizens, and that would be a light lactic sourness. So Saison, Hefeweizen, Berliner Weiss, Lambics, Flanders, lots of places where various levels of lactic sourness are accepted. Acetic sourness, not so much, really just the Flanders Red. My favorite off flavor of all time is butyric. Butyric. You don't come across it very often. It was like forever. I'd never found a vomit beer. I'd never found a beer that I would describe as being vomit-like. Vomit-like. That's how you describe butyric. And finally, I found one, and it was the craziest thing in the world. It was someone around here had made a 100% Brett beer, and they said every time they were doing a lot of Brett experimentation, and every time they tried 100% Brett beer, it came out like this. And he didn't know what was wrong with it. He wanted me to taste it. So I tasted it, and I couldn't put my finger on it. I'm like, I know, it was god awful. And it's like, I know this flavor. What is it? I'm like, vomit! Yes! It's like throw up. And so then once it was like, yes, that's it, it's butyric. And once we figured that out, then it was funny because we couldn't stop tasting it. It's like it was literally making us want to throw up, but we couldn't stop tasting it because as judges, it was an off flavor we had never really gotten to experience before. So you want to take advantage of that learning opportunity and really embed that one in your brain. So we tasted it over and over and over until I think it made us sick. But butyric, usually a bacterial contamination, but I think it can also come from the grain being contaminated and starting to get moldy before you use it. Like the grain gets wet and starts to mold, and then you use it at some point. that transfers through to the beer, I think, is butyric. For now, know it as a bacterial contamination and that it's like rancid butter, a putrid character, or vomit-like. And it's bacteria. Isovaleric, that's another really, really good one. When you know it when you got it, because it is like sweaty socks. It really is like sweaty socks. It stinks like someone's feet. And it usually comes from old hops. Cheesy old hops. Yeah, when we talk about using old hops in lambics, we're not talking about using cheesy old hops. We're just talking about using hops that have been well preserved. They're just old to the point where they've lost their bittering qualities. But they're not a yucky tasting hop. Using yucky tasting hops can lead to sweat socks or dirty feet, stinky, sweaty feet. And I've had a few of these. Beers, and there's no better way to describe it. It's like you open a bottle and it's like, who took their shoes off? It just smells like stinky feet. Infection. If you get sourness, like a lactic sourness and buttery, there's a chance that beer is infected when you get the combo. And they could both be from other things, right? Buttery could be diacetyl from the fermentation. Lactic sourness could be from an extended acid rest, right? But chances are, if you have these two off characteristics together, then chances are it's a contaminated beer, because that'll create both of those. Okay? It's like a pedio-lacto infection. Okay? Page 109 goes into a very, very quick review of all of the off flavors and things we've talked about. We've now covered all of the tech topics. We have nothing left to do now but talk about beer styles and judge beer styles. So porters and stouts. Confusing styles sometimes because of the overlap between the two. But really, if you stop and think about it, remember what I'm going to say to you, because it'll help you judge stouts and porters for the rest of your life. Okay? The only two that really get confused is the robust porter and a foreign extra or American stout. The robust porter can sometimes pass as a foreign extra or an American stout, or vice versa. Those two stouts can sometimes pass as robust porters. Brown porter is completely different. Baltic porter is completely different. All the other stouts have characteristics that are completely different. But those three styles, the American stout, foreign extra stout, and the robust porter, man, they bump right up against each other. So let's talk about porter in general. Porter in general, especially the two smaller ones, the two most common ones, the brown porter, the robust porter. These are roasty beers, but they both use a fair amount of chocolate malt. And that's really the big differentiator, is that chocolate malt, even in the robust porter. Because you're not going to use you can use much more chocolate malt in a robust porter than you would use in the foreign extra stout or the American stout. Chocolate should be backed off in a stout, and it can be increased for the robust porter. But like I said, those styles really bump into each other. But if you're cutting hairs and saying, well, what's the real differentiator here? Malt-wise, it's that chocolate malt percentage. Okay, that's in my humble opinion. So let's look at the brown porter, the London style porter. Ingredients: English ingredients are most common. Many contain several malts, including chocolate and/or dark roasted malts and caramel malts. Historical versions use a significant amount of brown malt. Usually does not contain large amounts of black patent malt or roasted barley. Okay, so this beer is really, really different. We want this beer to have that chocolate malt, cocoa type malt character. English or Irish ale yeast, occasionally lager yeast is used. May contain some adjuncts, some other sugars and molasses and things like that. Historical versions of a brown porter did have some sourness, some smokiness, and some Brett. But again, that would be a historical version. It would not be appropriate in this category. But it is important to know that there are historical porters out there that have some Brett in them. And they're pretty cool. They're neat beers. But they don't go here. Overall impression, a fairly substantial English dark ale with restrained roasty characters. Restrained roasty characteristics. Medium light to medium body. So the flavor, malt flavor includes a mild to moderate roastiness, frequently with a chocolate character, and often a significant caramel, nutty, and or toffee character. May have other secondary flavors such as coffee, licorice, biscuits, or toast in support. Should not have a significant black malt character, that acrid, burnt, harsh, roasted flavor. Although small amounts may contribute a bitter chocolate complexity. English hop flavor, moderate to none. Medium low to medium hop bitterness will vary with the balance from slightly malty to slightly bitter. Usually fairly well attenuated. Diacetyl should be moderately low to none. London or Dublin type water hardness is traditional. So these generally are really IBUs 18 to 35. But I'm not thinking a lot of them go that high. It's a broad range, but I always think of like the London Porter from Fuller's. You know, it's just such a pleasant beer. Wonderful chocolate malt character. Just enough hops to balance, just enough bitterness to balance with the beer. Very sessionable, kind of mild drinking porter. Delicious, delicious beer. Robust porter, on the other hand, a little bit bigger. IBUs 25 to 50. It's a huge range. Robust porters can be sweet or they can be really bitter. Right? It's a huge, broad category, which is another reason why it bumps up against the stouts, because the category here is just so broad. May contain several malts, prominently dark roasted malts and grains, which often include black patent malt. Chocolate malt and or roasted barley may also be used. Hops are used for bittering, flavor, and or aroma, and are frequently UK or US varieties. So hops are all over the board. Grain bill to some degrees all over the board. Hard water, ale yeast. A substantial, malty, dark ale with a complex and flavorful roasty character. Very broad. Flavor, moderately strong malt flavor, usually features a lightly burnt black malt character and sometimes chocolate and or coffee flavors, with a bit of roasty dryness in the finish. Overall flavor may finish from dry to medium sweet, depending on the grist composition, hop bittering level, and attenuation. May have a sharp character from dark roasted grains, although should not be overly acrid, burnt, or harsh. Medium to high bitterness, which can be accentuated by the roasted malt. Hop flavor can vary from low to moderately high. Fruity esters, moderate to none. Diacetyl, low to none. Medium to medium full body. A little more substantial than the brown, getting a little more into black malt. I don't like how the guidelines talk about chocolate almost being optional in this beer. I mean, if you take away the chocolate malt, it's a stout. It's one of those iffy things. It's like, to me, the porters need chocolate malt to stay in the porter category. But realize when you judge a robust porter, it's a really broad category, and it's hard to say I've had this conversation with people many, many times who say, oh, it's too roasty, it's a stout. Well, it's a broad category, man. You can't hardly tell the difference. It's just, let's jump to that. Let's jump to a 4 and extra stout. Realizing there's 2 varieties of 4 and extra. Similar to dry or sweet stout, but more gravity. All right, well that doesn't tell us much, so I guess we have to look at the dry and sweet stout. Dry stout. Ingredients. The dryness comes from the use of roasted, unmalted barley in addition to pale malt. Moderate to high hop bitterness and good attenuation. Flaked, unmalted barley may also be used to add creaminess. A small percentage, perhaps 3% of sour beer, sometimes added for complexity, generally by Guinness only. Water typically has moderate carbonation, No mention of chocolate in there. Sweet stout. Sweetness is in most sweet stouts comes from a lower bitterness level than dry stouts and a high percentage of unfermentable dextrins. Lactose and unfermentable sugar is frequently added to provide additional residual sweetness. A base of pale malt and may use roasted barley, black malt, chocolate malt, crystal malt, and adjuncts such as maize or treacle. So there you can optionally have some chocolate malt in the sweet stout. So go to 4 and extra, it says, well, it's similar to a dry or sweet stout. And we look over here, we're seeing mostly roasted barley and pale malt, but there is a slight mention of chocolate. Much more of a mention under a robust porter, everywhere it's mentioned, optionally and can have and all that. You see what I'm saying? But it's really, these are tough. 4 and extra stout, IBUs 30 to 70, 5.5 to 8%. So there's a whole range in there that's going to be very similar to a robust porter. And if you can have chocolate malt in a 4 and extra, and you can't have chocolate malt in a robust porter, they start to look the same. Let's look at comments on 4 and extra. A rather broad class of stouts. These can be either fruity and sweet, dry and bitter, or even tinged with Brett. Think of it either as a scaled up dry and or sweet stout, or a scaled down imperial stout. Highly bitter and hoppy versions are best entered as American style stouts. Flavor. Tropical versions can be quite sweet without much roast or bitterness, while export versions can be moderately dry, reflecting impression of a scaled up version of either sweet stout or dry stout. Roasted grain and malt character can be moderate to high, although sharpness of dry stout will not be present in any example. Tropical versions can have high fruity esters, smooth dark grain flavors, restrained bitterness. They often have a sweet rum-like quality. Export versions tend to have lower esters, more assertive roast flavors, and higher bitterness. The roast flavors of either version may taste of coffee, chocolate, or lightly burnt grain. Little to no hop flavor, very low to no diacetyl. So you can almost pass these off as either one. So it starts to become, how do you really differentiate these two? And to me, it's the accentuation of the chocolate malt. But realize when you judge them, you can be judging a 4 and extra as a robust porter, and it matches the style guidelines, and a robust porter as a 4 and extra matches the style guidelines. Okay. When you get to the intangibles, though, those little couple extra points of intangibles, I'm usually looking for a little chocolate malt character, a little more chocolate malt character in my porters. Right? The American stout. Let's look at that one. Common American base malts and yeast, varied use of dark and roasted malts, as well as caramel type malts. Adjuncts such as oatmeal may be present in low quantities. So once again, not a lot of description of the ingredients. Flavor, moderate to very high roasted malt flavors, often tasting of coffee, roasted coffee beans, dark or bittersweet chocolate. may have a slightly burnt coffee ground flavor, but this character should not be prominent if present. Low to medium malt sweetness, often with a rich chocolate or caramel flavor. Medium to high bitterness, hop flavor can be low to high. Generally reflects citrusy or resiny American varieties. Light esters may be present but are not required. Medium to dry finish. Overall impression of American Stout, a hoppy, bitter, strongly roasted, foreign-style stout of the export variety. Remember that the foreign extra stout and the American stout used to be one category. It wasn't until I think the 2008 change where they split that off and said, well, the American variety is really a little different. You know, Sierra Nevadas, you would never have that kind of hop character in an English style foreign extra. You know, you wouldn't have hops at that level that you would smell and taste, and they wouldn't be citrusy and grapefruity and that sort of thing. So it's like that. And the foreign extra already is covering two very different sub-styles with the sweet export version and the English version. So trying to throw the American version in there too, I think is just a little too much. So that one got split out, but roughly it's a foreign extra stout with American hop varieties. Okay. So those are the two stouts that are often commonly confused with the robust porter, and you can see why. Let's go back and look just a little bit at the dry stout again and the sweet stout. According to the guidelines, the 3% of sour beer is in the dry stout, whereas I've read elsewhere that it's not so much in the dry stout and that it's actually more in the foreign extra stout. That Guinness does that. Know what the guidelines say, not what you read, not what you read elsewhere. Okay, so the guidelines for your exam, it's the dry stout that can have up to 3% sour. Key thing to the dry stout, we looked at the ingredients, no mention of chocolate malt, really pale malt and roasted barley, right? Pale malt, roasted barley, some flaked barley to add to that creaminess and the big smooth shaving cream-like head and all that. Overall impression, a very dark, roasty, bitter, creamy ale. 4 to 5% in ABV, so not a huge beer. IBUs go up to 45 though, which is pretty bitter. Also, considering you're also adding roasted barley, which is going to increase the perception of that bitterness and dryness, right? So when everything kind of gets combined in there, should be a pretty dry beer. Mouthfeel, medium light to medium full body. That's a pretty broad range for this style. I think it's too broad personally. I mean, think about all of the dry stouts that are out there, all the classic examples. Guinness, Murphy's, Beamish, O'Hare's. Every one of those is a really thin, almost watery kind of beer. So for the mouthfeel to go up to medium full, I think it's being a little generous, but that's what it says. While most commercial versions rely primarily on roasted barley as the dark grain, others do use chocolate malt, black malt, or combinations of the three. So there is a slight mention of chocolate malt in there. You see a slight mention of chocolate malt in both the dry and the sweet, and then the foreign says, well, it uses the ingredients of the dry and the sweet. So you have to go back to there and then see that it's just a slight mention, ever so slight mention of chocolate malt. Whereas when you went back to the brown porter, I don't mean to be belaboring this point, but you go back to the robust porter and you see that mention of chocolate malt much more predominant throughout the description, right? So those little subtle things make a difference. The style evolved, the dry stout, the style evolved from attempts to capitalize on the success of London porters that originally reflected a fuller, creamier, more stout-like body and strength. When a brewery offered a stout and a porter, the stout was always the stronger beer. It was originally called a stout porter. You should know this history. Know that part right there? Modern versions are brewed from a lower OG and no longer reflect a higher strength than porters. The draft version of what is otherwise known as Irish Stout or Irish Dry Stout, bottled versions are typically brewed from a significantly higher OG, maybe designated as foreign extra stouts. So mouthfeel, medium light to medium full body, with a creamy character. Flavor, moderate roasted, grainy sharpness, optionally with light to moderate acidic sourness. Light to moderate acidic sourness. Medium to high hop bitterness, dry, coffee-like finish from roasted grains. May have a bittersweet or unsweetened chocolate character in the palate, lasting into the finish. Balancing factors may include some creaminess, medium low, no fruitiness, and medium to no hop flavor. No diacetyl. No diacetyl. The sweet stout, similar in gravity, can be a little bit bigger, but very different in character due to the lactose sugar that's put in there. Basically, it's back sweetened. Know that these are also milk stouts or cream stouts, but they can't use that descriptor anymore in England. The milk or cream is from the lactose or milk sugar that's used as a sweetener. The oatmeal stout. Pale caramel and dark roasted malts and grains. Oatmeal 5 to 10%. Used to enhance the fullness of body and complexity of flavor. Hops primarily for bittering, and the yeast. Water should have some tartness. Overall impression, a very dark, full-bodied, roasty, malty ale with a complementary oatmeal flavor. An English seasonal variant of sweet stout that is usually less sweet than the original and relies on oatmeal for body and complexity rather than the lactose for body and sweetness. Generally between sweet and dry stouts in sweetness. Variations exist from fairly sweet to quite dry. That's kind of how I always remembered these beers. The dry stout is very unique. So you got the small stout, the smallest, the dry stout, very unique in its dry, thin character. The sweet stout, very different in its sweetness and rich body and the use of lactose. And then step that up once more and add some oatmeal. Somewhere in between that broad range of dry to sweet, and add some oatmeal for creaminess, and you have the oatmeal stout. Okay? ABV about the same. So that's your three small ones. Then the three big ones are all like countries. Foreign, American, and Russian are your three big ones. Okay, so dry stout, sweet stout, oatmeal stout. Talked about the foreign extra stout. I kind of call that the kitchen sink. Everything but the kitchen sink of stouts. Super roasty, super bitter, super heavy, big in alcohol. It's just sort of everything, right? It's as stout as stout can get. American stout. We talked about that. Basically a foreign extra stout with American hops. Okay? Then we have the Russian Imperial Stout. The Russian Imperial Stout. The big boy. ABV 8 to 12%. IBUs 50 to 90. Still a broad range. They can be sweet or they can be really bitter. Most of them are kind of balanced, but they're just really, really big. Black barley wine. Kind of the nickname, just talking about its malt character, its complexity, and fruit, and everything that's involved there. Ingredients: well-modified pale malt, generous quantities of roasted malts, may have a complex grain bill using virtually any variety of malt. Any type of hops may be used. Ale yeast. Overall impression, an intensely flavored, big, dark ale. Roasty, fruity, and bittersweet, with a noticeable alcohol presence. Dark fruit flavors meld with roasty, burnt, or almost tar-like sensations, like a black barley wine with every dimension of flavor coming into play.
Flavor, rich, deep, and complex, frequently quite intense, with variable amounts of roasted malt and grains, maltiness, fruity esters, hop bitterness, and flavor. Medium to aggressively high bitterness. Medium low to high hop flavor. Moderate to aggressively high roasted malt grain flavors. Could suggest bittersweet or unsweetened chocolate, cocoa, and or strong coffee. Slightly burnt grain, burnt currant or tarry character may be evident. Fruity esters may be low to intense and can take on a dark fruit character of raisins, plums, prunes. Dark fruit. Malt backbone can be balanced and supportive to rich and barley wine-like. May optionally show some supporting caramel, bready, or toasty flavors. Alcohol strength should be evident but not hot, sharp, or salty. No diacetyl. Finish can range from relatively dry to moderately sweet, usually with some lingering roastiness, hop bitterness, and a warming character. The balance and intensity of flavors can be affected by aging, with some flavors becoming more subdued over time, and some aged vinous or port-like qualities developing as it gets some age on it. Okay? Now, one we didn't cover, let's go back to Baltic Porter, because that one kind of sometimes gets confused with Russian Imperial Stouts. But these beers are really different. Look at the ingredients, and you see the difference. First off, they're generally not ales. They often use a lager yeast or cold fermented if using an ale yeast. They use deep bittered chocolate or black malt so that you don't get that high, roasty, harsh, burnt-like character. You don't want that in this beer. And Munich or Vienna base malt. Alright? So that bready, toasty character that can come from those German malts. Continental hops may contain crystal malts and or adjuncts, brown or amber malt, common in historical recipes. A Baltic porter often has the malt flavors reminiscent of an English brown porter and the restrained roast of a Schwarzbier, but with a higher OG and alcohol content than either. Very complex with multi-layered flavors. Flavor. As with aroma, has a rich malty sweetness with a complex blend of deep malt, dried fruit esters, and alcohol. A prominent yet smooth Schwarzbier-like roasted flavor. Okay, so this can never be confused with the Russian Imperial. That is full-blown stout, right? Real harsh, acrid type burn characters, really roasty in the stout. Not in the Baltic. So Schwarzbier-like roasty flavor that stops short of burnt. Mouth-filling and very smooth. Clean lager character, no diacetyl. Starts sweet, but darker malt flavors quickly dominates and persists through the finish. Just a touch dry with a hint of roast coffee or licorice in the finish. Malt can have a caramel, toffee, nutty, molasses, or licorice complexity. Light hints of black currant and dark fruits. Medium low to medium bitterness from malt and hops, just to provide balance. Hop flavor from slightly spicy hops to from none to medium low. Generally quite full-bodied and smooth, with a well-aged alcohol warm. In the aroma reminiscent of plums, prunes, raisins, cherries, or currants, occasionally with a vinous port-like quality. So, some of that raisiny, plum-like character that sometimes you get at a Doppelbock, it's malt-derived. It's malt-derived. It's not an ester, it's that malt-derived fruitiness. Okay, we are going to talk about English IPA, American IPA, Imperial IPA, and then we are also going to jump to the strong ales. Old ale, English barley wine, American barley wine. Okay? We're going to look at all those together. There's a reason why we want to look at those together, and that's because sometimes, and I'll say this multiple times, especially when the others get back here,
sometimes it's hard to differentiate between big imperial IPAs and like an American barley wine. Especially as the American barley wine maybe gets some, or as either of them get some age on them and they start to tone down, and what separates them is the malt. The malt character is what separates these styles. The English IPA, ingredients. Pale ale malt. These are relatively simple grain bills on IPAs. They're hop delivery systems, you know. I always say in my other classes, you guys have heard me say this, the English IPA is a functional beer. It wasn't hops just for the sake of hops. It was hops for a reason, right? And when you think of it like that, you don't think of this beer going overboard and just being overly big. So, pale ale malt, well modified and suitable for single temperature infusion mashing. English hops. English yeast that gives it a fruity or sulfury minerally profile. Refined sugar may be used in some versions. High sulfate, low carbonate water is essential to achieving a pleasant hop bitterness in authentic Burton versions. Overall impression, a hoppy, moderately strong pale ale that features characteristics consistent with the use of English malt, hops, and yeast. Has less hop character and a more pronounced malt flavor than American versions. Did you note that there was nothing else? Pale malt. Pale malt. That's all we're talking about here. Pale malt. In a beer that's 1050 to 1075, 5 to 7.5%, 40 to 60 IBUs. 40 to 60? Are you serious? That's an IPA? That's not much bigger than an American Pale Ale. It was a functional beer. It was a functional beer. It had a reason for being bigger. They didn't make a beer because they just wanted to put a bunch of hops in it. They were trying to add extra bacteria inhibitors, and the alcohol and the extra hops did that, and then just everything else balanced out to that. So it was just enough to get the job done, not to overwhelm you with hops. It took us to do that. The Americans to do that. So 1050 to 1075 pale ale malt, English hops, English yeast. A pale ale brewed to an increased gravity and hop rate. Modern versions of English IPAs generally pale in comparison, pun intended, to their ancestors. The term IPA is loosely applied in commercial English beers today and has been incorrectly used in beers below 4%. This is very true. You have to watch out for that. Green King IPA, for instance, is a little bitty beer. History, brewed to survive the voyage from England to India. Technically, that's been corrected a little bit if you want to get technical. It was brewed to ferment and condition on the way to India. That's a little technicality that some people like to harp on. So it wasn't just a bigger beer that was made, they put in barrels and then shipped. It's like, well, actually, if we make this bigger beer and let it ferment on the voyage, so it gets there and it's done, then we didn't have to worry about fighting off bacteria and stuff the whole way there. You get there and it's finished, the story goes it was supposed to be diluted back. But who would do that after one taste? Okay, so a hoppy, moderately strong pale ale that features characteristics consistent with the use of English malt, hops, and yeast. Less hop character and more pronounced malt flavor than American versions, but that malt flavor is just pale ale malt. Flavor. Hop flavor is medium to high, with a moderate to assertive hop bitterness. The hop flavor should be similar to the aroma, floral, earthy, fruity, and or slightly grassy. Malt flavor should be medium low to medium high, but should be noticeable, pleasant, and support the hop aspect. The malt should show an English character and be somewhat bready, biscuit-like, toasty, toffee-like, and or caramely. Despite the substantial hop character typical of these beers, sufficient malt flavor, body, and complexity to support the hops will provide the best balance. This beer is about balance. Very low levels of diacetyl are acceptable, and fruitiness from the fermentation or hops adds to the overall complexity. Finish is medium to dry. Bitterness may linger into the aftertaste, but should not be harsh. Okay?
So not a super big beer. Focus on the pale malt. Probably get some kettle caramelization in there since there is no technical mention of caramel malts. I mean, they're pale ales for a reason. That's the type of malt they used. American IPA. Now this one is still, the guidelines kind of mess with people because IBUs go from 40 to 70. 40 to 70. A 40 IBU American IPA is called American Pale Ale, in my opinion. But, because if you got a 40 IBU IPA, it better not be 7.5%, right? It better be the small side of the scale. If it's the small side of the scale, so if it's 5.5% ABV and 40 IBUs, sorry folks, that's American Pale Ale. So, anyway, most of them are bigger than that. Some of these ranges are just a little too broad. Ingredients: pale ale malt, well modified and suitable for single temperature infusion mashing. American hops, American yeast, to give a clean or slightly fruity profile. Generally all malt but mashed at lower temperatures for higher attenuation. Water character varies from soft to moderately sulfate. Versions with a noticeable rye character should be entered in a different category. Those rye PAs should be entered elsewhere. Overall impression: a decidedly hoppy and bitter, moderately strong American Pale Ale. So it's a big version of an American Pale Ale. Flavor: hop flavors medium to high, should reflect an American hop character with citrusy, floral, resiny, piney, or fruity aspects. Medium high to very high hop bitterness, although the malt backbone will support the strong hop character and provide the best balance. Malt flavor should be low to medium and is generally clean and malty sweet, although some caramel or toasty flavors are acceptable at low levels. So, very little caramel, just like the American Pale Ale. Caramel should be absent in this beer. Too many people, I talked about this when I talked about the American Pale Ale, too many people put too much caramel in there, and they're really creating kind of an amber, American amber. There's a style for that. If you start putting too much malt character into your IPA, you're venturing into another territory. You could, even if you put too much malt character in there, you're venturing into American barley wine territory, which is why I'm kind of lumping these together. Okay, so English IPA, American IPA. Imperial IPA is everything on steroids. 7.5 to 10%, 60 to 120 IBUs. Again, 60 would be extremely low for an Imperial IPA. Ingredients: pale ale malt, basically the same discussion, except now we can use any kind of hops we want as long as we have a lot of them. Right? English, American, doesn't really matter as long as there's a whole bunch of them in there. Flavor: hop flavor is strong and complex. Can reflect the use of American, English, or noble hop varieties. High to absurdly high hop bitterness. Although the malt backbone will generally support the strong hop character and provide the best balance. Malt flavor should be low to medium and is generally clean and malty, although some caramel or toasty flavors are acceptable. So, very, very similar description to the other two. It's just bigger. It can use either type of hop. Okay, let's jump right into the American barley wine, because as I said when some people were out of the room, sometimes people make these American IPAs so big and so rich and so malty that I think they bump right up against the American barley wine. American IPAs should be very simple on the grain bill, very simple. Let the complex grain bill go to the barley wine. So let's look at the American barley wine. Ingredients: well-modified pale malt should be the backbone of the grist. Some specialty or character malts may be used. Dark malts should be used with great restraint, if at all, and most of the color arises from a lengthy boil. So the lengthy boil is where we're going to get some caramelization. Citrusy American hops are common, although any varieties can be used in quantity. Generally uses an attenuative American yeast, all right? But 8% to 12% ABV, big beer, IBUs 50 to 120. So if we read all that, it's like, wow, it's not a whole lot different than the Imperial IPA. Flavor. Strong, intense malt flavor. Strong, intense malt flavor. I didn't say that for the American IPA. Remember, the malt was pretty subdued. It wasn't about the malt. With noticeable bitterness. Moderately low to moderately high malty sweetness on the palate, although the finish may be somewhat sweet to quite dry, depending on the age. Hop bitterness may range from moderately strong to aggressive, while strongly malty, the balance should always seem bitter. Moderate to high hop flavor, any variety, low to moderately fruity esters, noticeable alcohol presence, but sharp or salty alcohol flavors are undesirable. Flavors will smooth out and decline over time, but an oxidized character should be muted and generally be masked by the hop character. May have some bready or caramely malt flavors, but these should not be high. Roasted or burnt malt flavors are inappropriate. So, some bready or caramely flavors, but they should not be high. You go back to the American IPA, and it said something fairly similar, right? So again, this is one of those little weird discrepancies where you read the two guidelines, these beers are practically the same. But we know they're different. We know an American barley wine is intensely maltier. Much, much maltier, much richer on the malt side than the American IPA or the Imperial IPA, all right? Aroma, very rich, intense maltiness. Hop character, moderate to assertive, and often showcases citrusy, da-da-da. So notice how they changed that for the Imperial IPA. It's all about the hops, and the malt's subdued. So it's about the intensity level of these characters. Low to moderately strong fruity esters and alcohol aromatics. Malt character may be sweet, caramely, bready, or fairly neutral. However, the intensity of aromatics often subsides with age, especially on the hops. Overall impression, a well-hopped American interpretation of the richest and strongest of the English ales. The hop character should be evident throughout, but does not have to be unbalanced. The alcohol strength and hop bitterness often combine to leave a very long finish. So this is what kind of gets me, is that if you read the ingredients, you read the flavor, and you read a lot of this stuff, it's like, man, it's not a whole lot different than American IPA or Imperial IPA, except maybe the intensity level that they describe the malt and the hops, right? Hops should be much higher with the IPA, a little more subdued in the American barley wine. In the American barley wine, the malt should sort of dominate the flavor and aroma, but not a lot of caramel, not that much rich, okay? But then comes the confusing part, because in the overall impression, it is a well-hopped American interpretation of, quote, the richest and strongest of the English ales. The richest and strongest of the English ales have a lot of malt character. Just note the difference between the IPA and the American barley wine should be the malt. The malt should get a lot more richer, a lot more complex with the barley wine. If it's that rich and complex in the Imperial IPA, it's probably leaning more towards a barley wine. If it's a barley wine, but it doesn't have that rich malt character, it's probably leaning more towards an IPA. But they do sort of bump into each other. Let's look at the English barley wine. Overall impression, the richest and strongest of the English ales. A showcase of malty richness and complex intense flavors. The character of these ales can change significantly over time. Both young and old versions should be appreciated for what they are. 8 to 12%. Ingredients, pale malt with judicious amounts of caramel malts. Well, over here, how can we have a well-hopped American interpretation of the richest and strongest of the English ales and not mention crystal malts? I don't get it. A little confusing. So, well-modified pale malt, judicious amounts of caramel malts. Dark malts should be used with great restraint. A lot of the color from a lengthy boil. Flavor. Strong, intense, complex, multi-layered malt flavors ranging from bready and biscuity through nutty, deep toast, dark caramel, toffee, and or molasses. Moderate to high malty sweetness on the palate, although the finish may be moderately sweet to moderately dry. Some oxidative or vinous flavors may be present, and often complex alcohol flavors should be evident. Alcohol flavors shouldn't be harsh, hot, or solventy. Moderate to fairly high fruitiness, dried fruit character. Go to the aroma, dried fruit character, intense or rich character of malt, including bready, toasty, toffee, molasses, or treacle. Aged versions have a sherry-like quality, possible vinous or port-like aromatics, generally more muted malt aromas, low to no diacetyl. Okay? The old ale is oftentimes just thought of as a small version of an English barley wine. But it's much broader than that. It's basically any strong English ale that doesn't fit anywhere else. So the winter warmers goes into the old ale category. Just any special beers, special seasonals that they make, that are just kind of big in character. No other place for them. This is the catch-all, the old ale category. Although the best old ales they're called old ales for a reason, and the best ones are ones that have been aged and are starting to pick up that port sherry-like character. So you can kind of think of them as a small English barley wine, but realize they don't have to be that rich and intense on the malt character. And the better examples are going to show some age notes. Okay, classic Rauch beer. Classic Rauch beer. Rauch means smoke in German. Okay, so it's smoke beer. This is the only kind of specialty beer that you need to know for the exam. Okay, fruit beers, spice herb vegetable beers, wood aged beers, other smoked beers. You don't need to know those for the exam. You need to know classic styles for the exam. So you don't need to know all those others. At least you didn't used to. If there is a question on any of those, spice herb vegetable, other smoked, wood aged, specialty, any of those, no. Those beers are all about the base beer. You have to specify a base beer, and then it's whatever you did to it. You put hot peppers in it, you put vanilla, you put coconut, whatever you did to it, all right?
Quick question.
Hang on. So you're looking for a base beer, that's right. Okay? Then you're looking for harmony and balance with whatever was done to it. So if you get a question on any of those beers, because I don't think it's going to be on there, but it might be. It's all about balance and harmony. Balance and harmony with the base beer. The base beer has to fit the style. Okay? There is one trick to that, in that in some categories you don't have to specify a sub-style. You could just say porter. This is the best way to do it. If you're entering competitions, just say stout. Don't say what kind of stout. As soon as you say what kind of stout, you're telling us judges exactly what that base beer should be. And that's the first thing we're going to look at is, well, it's supposed to be a sweet stout flavored with chipotle. First thing we're going to look at is it a good sweet stout? So you kill it right there if it's not an excellent sweet stout. If you just said chipotle stout, now we don't know.
It could be a dry stout, a sweet stout, a foreign extra stout, a Russian imperial stout, American stout, foreign extra stout. We don't know. We just have to judge it now within this gigantic broad range of stout. Well, it's some kind of stout. Yep, I'd say it's a stout. You think it's a stout? Yep, it's a stout. Okay, now we look at the next step of how does that Chipotle or whatever it is balance and harmonize with the base beer. Okay? So there's a whole trick to entering in those specialty areas and things. If it doesn't fit a classic style, then it goes to specialty. Unless it's a Belgian specialty, and there's a special category for Belgian specialty beers. Classic rock beer. This is the only one of the smoked, wood aged, and that sort of thing that you need to know because this is a classic style. This is a classic style. Other smoked beer is like anything else in smoking. Okay, but the classic rock beer is a specific classic style. Base beer is a Marzen, Oktoberfest. Okay, so you gotta look for that base Oktoberfest style. So you gotta know what the Oktoberfest style is first, right? So Vienna and Munich, decoction mashed, malt focused beer, all that, right? Then we want a wonderful smoke to go along with it. And that smoke can be at various levels. German rock malt, beechwood smoked, Vienna type malt typically makes up 20 to 100% of the grain bill, with the remainder being German malts typically used in a Marzen. Some breweries adjust the color slightly with a bit of roasted malt. German lager yeast, because it's Oktoberfest. German or Czech hops. 20 to 30 IBUs, so about like an Oktoberfest, maybe just a little bit more on the IBUs. About 5 to 6%. So everything about it's kind of like an Oktoberfest. And then the smoke. The intensity of smoke can vary widely. Not all examples are highly smoked. Allow for variation in the style when judging. Other examples of smoked beers are available in Germany, such as Box, Hefeweizen, and such. Those should be entered elsewhere. Marzen Oktoberfest style with a sweet, smoky aroma and flavor and a somewhat darker color than the traditional style. Flavor generally follows the aroma profile with a blend of smoke and malt in varying balance and intensity, yet always complementary. Marzen-like quality should be noticeable, particularly a malty, toasty richness, but the beechwood smoke flavor can be low to high. The palate can be somewhat malty and sweet, yet the finish can reflect both malt and smoke. Moderate, balanced hop bitterness with a medium dry to dry finish, the smoke character enhances the dryness of the finish. Clean lager character with no fruity esters, no diacetyl, no DMS. Harsh, bitter, burnt, charred, rubbery, sulfur, or phenolic smoky characteristics are inappropriate. Medium body. Under the aroma, when smoke increases, malt decreases, and vice versa. So when smoke increases, malt decreases. When the malt increases, the smoke decreases. You know, Schlenkerla is considered the classic example, but then you also have Spezial in there, and Spezial is much, much softer, you know, on the smoke, much lighter smoke. Before they redid the guidelines, Spezial was actually considered an other smoked beer because it wasn't smoky enough. Now it's considered part of the range. Spezial Rock Beer Marzen is now considered a classic rock beer. And it's not that smoky. It's smoky, but it's just not that smoky. So you go all the way from that one to Schlenkerla, which is, you know, intensely smoky. You know, campfire, just smoky smoke. So wide range, but you're looking for a good balance with the malt, right? You're looking for a good clean smoke character